Welcome back to the Bazaar. I'm Inko, and it's Wednesday. That means it's time to talk about the patch. And frankly, I don't have that much feedback on the patch. The current patch is really not a huge balance patch, very few changes were made, and I didn't have a ton of balance feedback on the previous patch, which was the best meta we'd seen so far. I think the meta is still great, I think all of my old feedback largely stands, and I'll reiterate that towards the end of the video, but there is a bit of new feedback I have based on the small handful of changes we've got. Most of it centered around one change that is on its own not a major impact to the game, but sort of expresses something from the developers that I don't agree with, and I want to have a real discussion about the value of randomness in games, healthy randomness and unhealthy randomness, and how I think specifically the random altar and a small handful of other things in the Bazaar are random in a bad way. Now, the impetus for this whole discussion is this change that came with the Jorts hotfix, where they removed the ability to scout random altars with loot enchantments. For anyone who doesn't know, you could previously get any enchantment on your loot items and then use those loot items to pass the enchantment on to something else that was affected by it. The best wins for this were insect wings because they affected any active item, and truffles because they affected any item, period. But they could roll golden, so if the items you had were active, insect wing was technically a bit better. Not really here nor there. The point is, you could go to a random altar, and instead of getting a random result, you could see what the result was first by scouting it with your loot item, and then make an informed decision as to where to place it, which was not as random as the developers wanted it to be, evidently. And I can see where they're coming from, but I personally loved this mechanic. Once you knew about all of the mechanics involved with it, you understood what these things did, it intuitively made sense that you could do this. It was a form of skill expression that gave you more decision points in the run. I really liked this as a mechanic. And with it being removed, the random altar is now truly random. And anyone who's been watching my patch feedback for a while knows that I don't currently like the enchant system of one altar and one random enchant. And with this having been done, now that the altar is completely random and the ability to play around it is gone, I'm going to go ahead and make a video predominantly around why I don't like the random altar. And I guess we need to start with like the baseline, because people will assume that I just hate all randomness in games. I don't think randomness is inherently bad. A deterministic Bazaar would be so alien to the current Bazaar and vastly inferior. The Bazaar is beautiful because of its randomness. Despite how much I care about optimization, how much I care about min-maxing and understanding the game, I don't dislike randomness. That's fine. It's what makes the Bazaar interesting. It's why all your runs are different. And I think pretty much everyone can agree that there is such a thing as too much randomness, right? Most people do not want to sit down to play a literal slot machine, and most people also don't want to sit down to play chess. The variance created by randomness has a sweet spot for pretty much everyone. Where you draw the line personally will vary, but I think pretty much everyone, if they really sit down and think about it, wants some randomness in the game, but not too much. And for me personally, I draw the line at the random enchant altar being the most powerful thing that's going to happen to you that happens in every run of the Bazaar. So if this is like the linchpin of your runs, right? It's the most important thing that happens. You hit level 10, you get an enchant. You die, you get an enchant. These are run-defining things, the most powerful things you will see in your entire run, and they're random with no ability to make an informed decision about them, and that, to me, is a bridge too far. That's where I draw my line, and I want to talk about why. I want to explain the current system, its pros and cons, and I want to compare it to another system that would be basically identical in effect, but with an informed decision. Right now, you're all familiar with this screen. When you hit level 10, level 19, or when you die, you get to pick from one enchantment altar where you see what it is and the random enchantment altar. Now, there are 12 possible enchantments in the game, but that does not mean there are 12 altars to pick from here. The golden and shiny enchantments do not have altars, and the freeze altar is so rare that I'm not even certain it can show up on these screens. Which means there are 9 possible altars that you see on the one where you get to make an informed decision. And then the random enchant is actually a little bit different than just an enchant altar that you cannot see, right? Because it can give you golden and shiny, which don't have the enchants, and it can give you frozen, which is incredibly unlikely if it's even possible at all. So that's one way it's different. Additionally, it can't give you an enchant that the item you put in is unable to accept. So for something like Swashbuckle or Ledger, there's only actually 3 enchants those items can hit, and it's very different from just a second enchant altar on those. So I do want to be clear that the current system is not the same as just 2 enchant altars, but the second one is behind a door and you can't look at it, right? And there is interesting decision making with this, right? You have to evaluate what is the best value of the enchant you're being offered here against what is the average value of a random enchant on your item that benefits the most from a random enchant. And there's even more complicated decision making than that it gets into, but that'll be true with any enchant thing, where it's like, are you trying to put it on the item that makes you the strongest right now? Are you trying to keep that item open for a better enchant down the line? Stuff like that. That's a little bit deeper than we need to go for the discussion of comparing the two systems though. And I think it's very easy to look at this system and say that it's actually more complicated and has more room for skill expression than picking from two altars where you got to know what the second one was, right? Because then you would just get to look at like all the possible options for the two altars and then pick the best one. It's not that complicated. But because now you have to evaluate what the average result is on the random enchantment for your best targets for it, which will get various different enchantments depending on what the item is, it's actually a lot more knowledge stealing before you really get to the point where you fully understand which one is better or worse. My issue with the artist isn't that the decision isn't complicated or doesn't matter. My issue is that when you finally get good enough at the game to reliably make the correct call with the artist, to say this enchant does nothing for my build or does a lot less than a random enchant might, you find yourself pretty consistently, I'd say in like a third of enchant altars, almost immediately picking the artist, where for your build it's very obvious that the enchant offered is not anywhere near good enough and you can do far better. And the issue with the artist then is not that the decision isn't interesting. It's that the decision is completely random. It is not an informed decision, and it is the most extreme source of power spike in the entire run that is this random decision that is not informed. But where it really sours on me, where it goes from something I dislike to something I viscerally dislike, is that when you talk about optimizing around randomness, you probably as a game designer also want to talk about making sure that optimal decision making doesn't regularly feel terrible. Because anyone who's been playing the game for any period of time has clicked on the artist and gotten the enchant that was offered alongside it. They've gotten a different enchant that was equally useless for their build. Because very frequently, about a third of the enchants the artist can give will be equal to or worse than what was offered already. Even though it is the correct decision to take the artist in these situations, picking the artist will in a third of situations feel like shit, and it feels exceptionally worse because then you immediately go into PvP fights against people whose enchants might actually matter and be the reason their build is good. Having this decision be an uninformed gamble really feels terrible. It's not just that the most extreme source of power in the run is random, it's also that it very, very consistently bites the player on top of that. And to draw a comparison to another mechanic within the game, there is the enemy on day 9, the legendary Death Knight Reaper, and I think this is a very clear comparison for what I'm talking about here. Death Knight Reaper, for the vast majority of builds, I know there are builds that shield to the moon and they beat him 100% of the time. I know there are builds that are crazy and they kill him before the scythe goes off. But for the majority of builds in the game, in my experience, you will get to Death Knight Reaper and you will say you don't kill him before the scythe goes off once, but you do kill him before the scythe goes off twice. I feel like that's where most builds exist. And the way that that works is the scythe hits for a third of your max health, but it actually hits for 2/3 of your max health because of the runic great axe, and it has a 20% crit chance because of Deadly Eye. So in 4 out of 5 fights, the scythe does not crit, and you kill the Death Knight Reaper. In 1 out of 5 fights, the Death Knight Reaper kills you and you just got rolled by the crit RNG. Now, if this fight were meant as a reward for people with really good shield, it would be fine. And that might even be the intention for it. But the problem is that when you do the analysis and you look at the other fights available on the day, Elite Duelist, Pharaoh's Khan, Yurden, Bloodreed Captain, Oasis Guardian all give 2 experience. Death Knight Reaper gives 5. 80% of the time you get 5 experience, and then 20% of the time you get 0. On average, Death Knight Reaper is 4 experience. The experience is by far the most valuable part of a monster encounter, and it on average gives twice as much as the other encounters you can choose from. The issue is that when you make optimal decisions here, you will 1/5 of the time just get nothing and get punished. There's not really anything else to it. And that's deeply frustrating from an optimization and player and experience standpoint. I do not enjoy Death Knight Reaper having Deadly Eye at all. It only makes the game less enjoyable. It doesn't change my decisions. It doesn't reward shield builds because the math is pretty straightforward. He's worth fighting, even though 1/5 of the time you'll get nothing. And that is exactly what's wrong with the Random Enchant Altar. It's pretty clear in most situations which enchant you want to pick. And as a result of that, in a pretty substantial portion of the time, you will make the correct decision and then get nothing, or get something so vastly inferior to what you could have gotten that it feels like nothing. And because this is the biggest source of power in a run, where you are going to spend the rest of the run exposed to other people's results to it, that feels terrible. And at least if the decision were informed, you would have not had to gamble and then get punished for it, right? At least you would have been able to pick the better of the two options and not just open door number 2 and find out it was a heal enchant on your weapon, Vanessa, right? I want to be clear though, I've been complaining about the Random Enchant Altar a lot. I actually think the Random Enchant Altar as a mechanic is completely fine. Just like the fact that it can just show up on an hour, I actually think that's a more interesting hour than like a heal enchant or a crit enchant or an obsidian enchant. I think the Random Enchant Hour as an event is perfectly fine. But as the thing that defines runs at levels 10, 19, and death, I don't know why we're making it a mainstay of the game when it's so incredibly volatile and the decision making around it feels so viscerally bad so often. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on randomness. I really dislike the Random Enchant Altar and its current implementation as a mainstay of power in the game. I'm not going to harp on it anymore. It's just going to be a thing at the end of these videos where I'm like, by the way, still hate the Random Enchant Altar. But very seriously, seeing this makes me feel like the devs want the Random Enchant Altar to be really, truly random. And I get that that's what it's supposed to be, but at the same time, it's committing to uninformed gambling being an essential, unmitigatable part of the run, and I don't see the value in that. If you gave us 2 enchantment options instead, it would be exactly what it is now, except that instead of being able to focus down on really good odds on stuff like Swashbuckle and Ledger going into a Random Enchant Altar, you would just get to see it ahead of time and those items would not receive the advantage they currently do. I don't understand the benefit of making it an uninformed gamble. People talk about it like it makes runs have higher variance. The altars being randomly selected enforces the same variance. It is objectively the same amount of variance whether you can see what's behind the altar or not. It does not make the game more random to use the Random Enchant Altar, it just takes away the decision point. That's what this change is. That's why I'm so frustrated by it, is because it didn't make the game harder or more complicated, it just took away a decision. Anyway, to make sure I don't skip over anything that's new, we're going to quickly recap the patch notes, the things that actually matter that I have feedback on. For the hotfix, the truffles change, I hate. Not because I think truffles are underpowered now, because truffles are a loot item. Previously, truffles were worth twice as much as any other loot item. That was the value they provided. Sure, you didn't get a sender or a medkit or whatever, but you got twice as much gold. Now, these sell for coin value. They actually sell for less value than any other loot at gold and diamond, which means that not only do you not get any additional value from selling the item, you actually get less value at gold and diamond. This only does anything on Pygmalion or specifically with Cove on Vanessa. This should not be a universal loot item in its current state. Either make it a pig item again or rework it so it has value as loot. Truffles should not be a loot item if it is just a coin, because coins are not loot items, because they are not worth being a loot item. This is a very strange and bad effect for a loot item. It shouldn't be universal. Let's move on. Now, it's not actually mentioned anywhere in these patch notes, but I will follow this up with another statement. The change to enchants where items generate items that have the same enchant. So a fiery gumball machine generates fiery gumballs, and a shovel digs up fiery items, right? That seems really broken to me. For stuff that is not generating loot items, for stuff like the shovel and DJ Robot, maybe it's okay. I'm inclined to think it's definitely not okay, but I'm not certain. I've seen so many enchanted DJ Robot runs steamroll through me and done the same to others, so I'm inclined to think it's just broken on everything. But especially for Tropical Island and Gumball Machine where they're generating loot items, so a fiery tropical island is plus 12 burn per day, that's absolutely crazy. That's what Lemonade Stand got changed for. It's not really okay. So even though it's not in the patch notes, and it's a very important part of the patch feedback, that the current way generated enchanted items work seems wildly overpowered and probably not good. For Dooley's reworks, I think both DJ Robot and Thermal Lance are very powerful. I've heard a lot of people claiming that they're overpowered and need to be nerfed. I'm really not wholly convinced that's true. Maybe the numbers could be slightly toned down on the nanobots for DJ Robot. But realistically, I think they're both just strong items that aren't that wildly out of line. If they get nerfed, I want it to be like a slight damage nerf on nanobots, a slight burn to like multiples of 4 on thermal lance. I kind of feel like people are reacting to these cards the same way they would react if like Flagship were just reworked into its current state, right? Everyone be like, oh my god, Flagship's so broken, but like, it's just a good card. Thermal Lance and Robot might be very slightly overtuned, but I don't want to see them nerfed very badly, and I think leaving them as they are right now probably isn't a huge problem. The patch notes didn't mention this, most of the freeze skills got nerfed by 1 second. Quick Freeze, the haste freeze skill, not actually mentioned here, which makes sense because it wasn't nerfed. That one probably needs to get hit by the same thing. The reworks to skills like Coolant Leak, I think, are just almost unplayable. I think every one of these skills is very weak. Coolant Leak is like almost usable because freeze items are so powerful, but the other ones like Lefty Loosey and Righty Tighty, like this effect as a silver skill, the first 2 times you use a right item charges slow item 1 second. You compare that to like any flat plus skill and it gets blown out of the water. These are like very, very niche effects, and even the builds that want them don't get a ton out of them. They all feel incredibly weak. And lastly, for the current patch notes, I like the new Steel Storm skill. I think all the skills like Static Acceleration and Conflag that went down to Silver Start feel really good. I think those are all very positive changes, just strong things that are worth engaging with. And I will note that Property Baron might be like kind of weirdly strong for a silver encounter at this point. He essentially gained 25% crit chance in addition to his reworked billboard that now does something other. Like, he used to have 25%, now he has 50% crit chance, and the reworked billboard has just been fully added to his board in addition to that, basically. So it feels a little bit like he's kind of too strong for a silver enemy. But as long as we're giving feedback on silver enemies that are too strong, we can go ahead and beat a dead horse here. What on earth is going on with Ghost Pepper? This dude's just completely out of line. This is a silver day 7 enemy. He's more dangerous than literally any day 8 enemy, except maybe on very few builds Radiant Corsair. And he is straight up more dangerous than every day 8 enemy except for Dragon. As a silver day 7 enemy, he's just insanely strong. You could remove Fiery from this guy entirely, and he still wouldn't be weak for a middle encounter on day 7. He is, in my eyes, second only to Lich for enemies that are wildly out of line, and it is a fan conspiracy theory that the reason Lich isn't being nerfed is so that Tempo can take the data on which builds beat Lich to determine what they should nerf. So like, yeah, Lich is still broken, I'm assuming you know and don't care, but Ghost Pepper is wildly overpowered and he's like a middle encounter, so it doesn't make sense that he would be. I guarantee you that new players will see Ghost Pepper, fight him, and get steamrolled and be like, what the fuck, he was just supposed to be a guy, he wasn't even the rightmost encounter. Now, in terms of general feedback for like the minutia of item balance, I don't really get into that. If there are specific items that are way too powerful, I will call that out because that's something that needs to be brought down for the health of the game. But I generally just assume that Tempo has more experience balancing items than I do, obviously, and data that I don't have, so I don't really bother with it. But I will say, last patch I wanted to see all the weak items that didn't need a nerf that got bonked get buffed back up in some way. Poster child for this is Katana. Katana being objectively worse than a Fang is deeply sad. This item needs help, and so many other weak items need help. The meta is in a great spot. It's the most balanced and diverse meta I've ever seen in the game, but that doesn't mean that every character doesn't have like dozens of shit items that you really don't ever want to build with. And sure, they might have synergy and be usable in your current build, but you never set out to use them and they're always temporary, and Katana is definitely one of those items right now. The only item I'll specifically call out as probably needing a nerf is the Ledger. Ledger is probably the strongest economy item in the history of the game, especially because its only enchants are Golden and Shiny, which are both just double the effect of the Ledger in different ways. And as a result, if you are playing any sort of scaling build, you can randomize this if you get a bad enchant for a 2/3 chance at doubling the best economy item the game has ever had. You can use this to such disgusting effect, and I suspect the reason Truffles was nerfed was actually a nerf that should have targeted Ledger, because the problem was that Truffles were going to insane values, but Ledger is the reason they were doing that. I think Ledger is a huge portion of why Property Pig is so strong right now. I consistently have runs where I like claw out 7 to 10 victories on Property Pig without Ledger, and when I do have Ledger, I find that I just steamroll straight to 10 because of how much additional value it gives. I think a disproportionate amount of power for all of Pig's economy and all of Property Pig is in this one item, so this needs to be nerfed and that power needs to be distributed elsewhere. if Pig even needed the power in the first place. That's all of my current patch feedback. I have nothing else to add there, but I'm going to reiterate all the points that I always reiterate because I still believe these things. I'm going to keep giving this feedback every single time. And first and foremost on that list, the current monetization system is bad. I was fine with that not really being changed in the middle of the month. It's kind of too late to fix this month, but it needs to be meaningfully improved on the next season. It's kind of fucking important. And as part of that, though, maybe the most important part is that right now players have literally no incentive to play normal. Fun is not a reason to play normal. This is often used as a defense of the fact that normal doesn't progress your game at all. The fact that free-to-play and less skilled players cannot progress their collection if they want to outside of the free tickets they are being given like at a metered pace by the pass, this feels very bad. It feels worse than playing on normal with no rewards if there wasn't a system that inspired FOMO. Normals need an incentive. And while we're on the subject of free-to-play players, for this whole video I've been opening howbazaar.gg to show things off. New players and casual players need a codex. That needs to be a priority, and the game really cannot launch officially without one. The stash is not keybindable, but it is keybound. It's on spacebar. And anyone who plays with that will find out the stash is very unresponsive. Both of those things need to be improved. There's an unintended game mechanic where dynamic multiplication and static multiplication stack and they get snapshotted and multiply more than they should. 2 times 2 equals 6 in this case. If you use spices on an obsidian weapon, rather than 1 times 2 times 2 equals 4, you get 1 times 2 times 2 equals 6 because of this. I've shown it in great detail before. I'm sure the devs know exactly what I'm talking about. And this is both deeply unintuitive to new players, feels like a bug, feels bad to lose to. It creates massive outliers in power that really shouldn't exist. And even though it is technically how the game should work, that didn't stop us from killing Scouting the Enchant Altar, so maybe we should code an exception for this so that, like, Sniper Rifle doesn't get 10 times the damage bonus from spices, you know? It feels like this sort of thing where even if it makes sense that it's happening, once you understand all this stuff, it's deeply unintuitive to a newer player and wild outliers in power for everyone. Unrelated to this video, I just searched B1, B2 Wiki and opened the wrong B1 and B2 from the Bananas and Pajamas franchise. Apparently that's a thing. Is this a reference? Anyway, what I was gonna say is B1 and B2 are an objectively worse event than the Lost Crate, and one of those events needs to change because there should not be one event that is objectively worse than another event, and currently that's the case. The skills Alacrity and Flurry of Blows really need a rework, and I will say this every time until it happens. They're able to charge the item that triggers them, which creates really broken one-weapon builds where the weapon goes off, and then it uses all of the additional charges instantly and goes off like 6 more times. It needs to be reworked the same way that Flashy Reload was to prevent this. You will always have a system where one-weapon Vanessa is a viable build, but one-weapon Vanessa with Alacrity or Flurry of Blows is a crazy cracked build, and one skill should not represent the amount of power that it does in its current implementation. The Armored Core is still in a terrible spot, and I don't like picking from 2 cores because not all cores are good. That's basically the problem with Dooley right now, is that Dooley's cores do not feel equal. Some cores can get you some early wins before you give up on them, some cores are just bad, and some cores are insane, and the cores just need general balance and rework, and that is not as simple as buffing or nerfing cores. It includes like the items for the cores. As an example for like why Armored Core feels bad, it's just that cards like Brick Buddy feel terrible. If almost all the shield items for a character are not good, then the shield core isn't good. And that's sort of what's happening with Dooley. The shield archetype for Dooley feels terrible, and it's part of what's feeding into the core choice on Dooley not feeling great either. I've already talked about the artist at length, but if we are going to stick with this current system, it'd be very nice if there was an exception coded so the artist could not give you the same enchant it was already offering you. That feels terrible. Anything where a random selection gives you the same thing as the alternative, like that's just the illusion of choice. It's funny sometimes, but for something like this, it shouldn't be happening. The red envelope skill was removed because it was just an event. It just gave you 10 gold. This is just an event. It's not a skill. It doesn't do anything during a combat. It just upgrades the core. That's just an upgrade hammer. It's not a skill. This needs to be reworked for the same reason. And that's gonna be it for today. I'm really interested in hearing if anyone has like a good defense for the current enchant altar. Like, do you really like that the random enchant altar is in fact random? That it's a really easy decision in most builds to either not take random because the other one's great or take random because the other one's bad, and then you just go to the casino? Because that's how it feels to me. I really dislike the random altar, and it's not because the random altar is too random. It's fine as an hourly event. It's because it's so incredibly powerful and you're guaranteed to see it twice in pretty much every run, and that just feels really bad to me. that the most important part of my build is also the most random part of the game. You know what? I'm gonna cut this out. I started to ramble and backtrack and talk about the Random Enchantment Altar again. I'm pretty sure you got the picture. You don't need to hear it a second time. I don't like the current system for enchants. I dislike how important the artist is, and that's enough on the subject. Thank you for your time. If you made it this far, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the like button on your way out. If you aren't subbed to the channel, you can sub for more daily Bazaar content just like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.